From now on, you are my sworn enemy." My father's roar shook the chandelier above us. His words cut sharper than any knife, echoing in the marble-lined foyer of the house I had grown up in. He didn't whisper it. He didn't mutter it in anger. He declared it like a general on a battlefield in front of my relatives, his business associates, and the neighbors who had come by to congratulate him on his new real estate deal. And all because I had chosen to marry a man he thought was beneath me, a man who at that time drove for Uber to pay his bills. The room fell silent. The air was so thick with judgment that I could feel it pressing on my skin. My cousins looked away, embarrassed. My aunt gave a nervous cough. And my father, red-faced, pointed a shaking finger at me. "You throw away everything. Your name, your chance at a future. For this nobody. You're no daughter of mine. Get out." I remember my mother's photograph sitting on the mantel above the fireplace, her soft smile frozen in time. She had passed when I was young, and I often wondered if she would have spoken up, if she would have stood between us. But that night, there was no one to soften his rage. I swallowed the lump in my throat. My husband, still only my fiancé at the time, squeezed my hand. He didn't flinch. He didn't look ashamed. His dark eyes held steady, as if silently telling me, "We'll be okay. Don't break now." That was the night my father cast me out of his life. The days that followed were like waking from a fever dream. I had grown up in privilege. Our home had been a landmark in town, a place where charity fundraisers and business dinners were held. I went from cocktail dresses and catered dinners to sitting in a modest apartment with peeling paint where the landlord barely fixed the heating. My husband then, just my young partner in life, drove his car day and night. He'd come home with tired eyes smelling of stale coffee and city traffic. But he'd still smile when he saw me. I worked odd shifts at a community center and volunteered on weekends with veterans still serving part-time in the Army Reserve. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Some nights, I lay awake wondering if my father was right. Had I doomed myself? Had I thrown away everything for love? The laughter of my old friends, the security of family wealth, the certainty of a place in society, it all seemed like another lifetime. Yet every morning, when my husband handed me a mug of cheap coffee with that same steady look in his eyes, I knew I'd made the right choice. I had grown up watching my father build his empire. He started from small construction contracts and turned them into a real estate business worth millions. He was ruthless, admired by some, feared by many. For him, life was about winning, about climbing higher, no matter who you stepped on. But love, compassion. He treated those things like weaknesses. He couldn't fathom that I would choose a man with no pedigree, no fortune, no value in the world he understood. To him, marrying a poor Uber driver was like spitting on everything he had built. For me, it was the opposite. For the first time, I was choosing myself. A month after that night, I came across him by accident at the courthouse. I had gone to file a form for my reserve duties, and he was there with his lawyer. He didn't look at me, didn't even acknowledge my presence, as though I had ceased to exist. I can't explain the kind of pain that delivers. It's not the sharp cut of words, it's the dull ache of being erased, of knowing your own blood has decided you're dead to him. But standing there in that hallway that smelled of floor polish and stale coffee, I realized something. If he had declared me his sworn enemy, then I would stop begging for his approval. I would live my life on my terms. That realization was both terrifying and freeing. My husband and I married in a small ceremony at a friend's backyard. No champagne towers, no designer gowns. Just fairy lights strung between trees, a borrowed speaker playing our favorite songs, and a few friends who believed in us. I wore a simple white dress, one I found on clearance at a department store. He wore a rented suit that didn't quite fit around the shoulders. And yet I swear I felt more beautiful and more loved that day than at any banquet my father had ever thrown. We vowed not only to love each other, but to build together, to never let pride destroy us, to work no matter how hard, side by side. As we kissed beneath the twinkling lights, I caught a glimpse of my father's world in my memory-polished floors. Fake smiles, empty toasts. And for the first time, I didn't envy it. That night, as we sat cross-legged on the floor of our tiny apartment, sharing leftover pizza from the wedding party, my husband raised a paper cup of soda and said, "To the start of something real." I clinked my cup against his. My heart was both heavy and hopeful. Heavy with the loss of a father, hopeful with the promise of a life we carve out ourselves. I didn't know then what the future held, but deep down, a quiet voice whispered, "One day he'll see. One day he'll know what we're made of." And I held on to that. In the months after our wedding, life tested us in ways I never could have imagined. The shine of love kept us warm, but reality pressed hard against our door. Bills piled up, the car needed repairs, and our rent was late more than once. My husband Daniel drove through the night to keep us afloat. Sometimes he'd come home with his shoulders slumped, his shirt damp from a summer rain, eyes heavy from staring at taillights for 12 hours straight. Yet the moment he stepped inside and saw me, he'd manage a smile. That smile was never fake. It was weary, but it was filled with determination. Meanwhile, I balanced two worlds: my reserve duties and civilian life. One weekend, I'd be in uniform drilling with fellow soldiers, reminded of discipline and purpose. The next, I'd be at the community center folding donated clothes or tutoring kids who needed extra help. My uniform gave me respect, but it didn't pay much. The center gave me purpose, but not a paycheck that could stretch far enough. We were living in a one-bedroom apartment where the paint flaked from the walls and the radiator clanged in the middle of the night like it was haunted. The kitchen floor sloped just enough that if you dropped an apple, it would roll into the corner and hide there. Our neighbors argued through the walls, their words muffled but sharp. Still, that little place became our haven. I learned quickly how to stretch a dollar. I clipped coupons, cooked beans and rice, and shopped at thrift stores. I still remember the joy of finding a coat for $5 that actually kept me warm through a bitter winter. Daniel would joke, "See, you're better at logistics than half the generals in the Pentagon." We laughed, but deep down, I knew we were surviving on grit and stubborn faith. There were days when despair tried to creep in, like the time our car broke down on the way to my reserve training, and I had to call a fellow soldier for a ride. I remember sitting in the back seat, cheeks burning with shame, thinking about how my father probably still hosted lavish dinners, his guests sipping expensive wine in the house I once called home. And yet, there was something powerful about struggle. It stripped life down to the essentials. There were no servants, no silver trays, no false compliments. Just us two people holding each other up, learning the value of every single step forward. One night, as I sat at the table with unpaid bills spread before me, Daniel placed his hand over mine. "We'll get through this," he said softly. "I know it feels impossible now, but one day we'll look back and laugh." I wanted to believe him. His optimism sometimes felt naive, but then I remembered what had drawn me to him in the first place. He never measured worth in money or status. He measured it in resilience, in honesty, in loyalty. That night, I stared at those bills, took a deep breath, and said, "Okay, then let's plan." We began making small goals: pay down one debt, save $50 a month, put aside anything extra, no matter how small. It was humbling, but it was also empowering. For the first time in my life, I wasn't leaning on my father's name or his money. Everything we built with our own hands. Of course there were whispers. Old acquaintances would run into me at the grocery store and ask, "So, how's life treating you?" Their eyes flicked to my plain clothes, my off-brand shoes. They'd nod politely, but I could feel their judgment. One former friend even said, "I still can't believe you gave up everything. Your dad must be furious." I wanted to snap back, to defend my husband, to explain that love was worth more than any bank account, but instead I just smiled and said, "We're happy." Because we were. Happiness didn't need their approval. What surprised me most was how much Daniel's kindness carried us. He wasn't just driving Uber. On weekends, he started helping elderly neighbors fix things around their homes. He refused payment, but word spread. Soon, one neighbor insisted on paying him for handyman work. Another recommended him to a friend. Little by little, Daniel was sowing seeds of something bigger. His reputation wasn't built on wealth, but on trust. People knew if he promised to show up, he would. If he said he could fix it, he'd stay until it was done right. I watched him work late nights at the kitchen table, teaching himself bookkeeping and business basics from YouTube videos. He had grease on his hands during the day, numbers on his mind at night. I realized then that success doesn't come like a lightning bolt, it builds like dawn, slowly lighting the horizon. For me, the Army Reserve became more than a duty. It became a foundation. I earned respect from my unit, received commendations for my leadership, and even had opportunities for advanced training. There was a moment during one drill when my commanding officer pulled me aside and said, "You've got potential. Don't waste it." His words struck deep. My father had always told me I was a disappointment, but here was someone who saw value in my discipline and grit. It lit a fire in me. When Daniel and I compared notes at night, his small business jobs, my progress in the reserves, we began to see a bigger picture. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were planting the seeds of a future. There were setbacks, of course. Clients who didn't pay, nights when the car broke down again, training that kept me away from home for weeks. But every time we regrouped, every time we reminded each other why we had chosen this life. I'll never forget one winter when the heating broke in our apartment. We bundled under blankets, our breath visible in the air. Daniel pulled me close and whispered, "At least we have each other." In that freezing room, I felt warmer than I ever had in my father's mansion. That was when I knew, whatever it took, whatever sacrifices we had to make, we were building something no one could take from us. Years passed like that with sweat tears, and small victories stacking quietly unnoticed by the world. My father never called, never visited. If he heard about our lives, he never let it show. To him, I was still the daughter who betrayed him. But to me, I was becoming someone stronger than I ever thought possible. And to Daniel, I was his partner, his equal, his reason to keep pushing. We were poor, yes, but poor in dollars, not in dignity, and that distinction kept us going. If the first years of our marriage were about survival, the next chapter was about momentum. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. But looking back, I can see how the small steps we took, the sacrifices we made, began to stack up into something real. Daniel's side jobs grew from word of mouth. At first, it was just helping neighbors fix leaky faucets, patch drywall, or replace light fixtures. But soon, his phone buzzed with calls from friends of friends. People wanted him because he was reliable, because he showed up when he said he would, and because he treated even the smallest job with care. By the third year, he was doing more than handyman work. He started bidding on small renovation projects. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with him as he nervously filled out his first official contract. His handwriting wobbled on the signature line, but his eyes sparkled with determination. "We're really doing this," he whispered. "Yes," I told him we are. Meanwhile, I was advancing steadily in the Army Reserve. My dedication caught the attention of higher-ups. I was given opportunities for leadership training and entrusted with responsibilities I hadn't imagined when I first enlisted. During one weekend drill, my unit was tasked with coordinating a simulated humanitarian response. I led a small team organizing supplies, assigning roles, and managing communication. When the exercise ended, my commanding officer pulled me aside. "You're a natural leader," he said. "Don't underestimate yourself." Those words meant more than I could explain. For years, my father's voice had echoed in my head, telling me I was a disappointment, that I had ruined my life. But here was someone who saw me differently, someone who believed in my ability to command respect. It gave me the courage to push harder, to apply for specialized training, to step into roles I might once have thought were out of reach. Our apartment slowly transformed too. I'll never forget the day we replaced our old wheezing radiator with a new unit, or when we painted over the peeling walls with a soft cream color, making the space feel brighter. These weren't just cosmetic changes. They were symbols, proof that things were moving forward, even if only by inches. Then came the first real breakthrough. Daniel landed a contract to renovate a small office space downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work for 3 months. He hired 2 part-time helpers, our first employees. I'll never forget how proud he looked standing in that dusty office with a tape measure in hand, calling out instructions. When the project wrapped, the client was so satisfied that he recommended Daniel's services to another business owner. One project turned into two. Two turned into four. By the end of the year, Daniel's one-man gig had grown into a modest company. Money didn't flood in like a tidal wave. It trickled in like a steady stream. But for the first time, we weren't constantly worried about overdue bills. We started a savings account. I can still picture the day we deposited our first $1,000. Daniel slipped the receipt into his wallet like it was treasure. At night, we still ate beans and rice sometimes, but now we did it with a sense of pride. This wasn't desperation anymore. It was discipline. I still faced moments of doubt. Old wounds don't heal quickly. One Sunday, I ran into my cousin at the grocery store. She eyed my plain clothes and said with a condescending smile, "So, how's Uber life treating you?" I wanted to lash out, but instead I smiled and replied, "Better than you think." Then I walked away, holding my head high. That night, I told Daniel what had happened. He just laughed and said, "One day, they'll eat their words." I believed him. Our marriage deepened through these years. We weren't just partners in love. We were partners in building a life. When Daniel struggled with bookkeeping, I stayed up late beside him learning QuickBooks so we could manage the accounts together. When I was nervous about an upcoming training exercise, he quizzed me on procedures until I felt confident. We celebrated small victories, paying off a credit card, buying our first used truck for the business, passing an inspection. Each milestone felt like a mountain conquered. By the 7th year, we had saved enough for a down payment on a modest home. It wasn't a mansion. It was a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood with a yard where we planted a small garden. When we signed the papers, I thought about how my father had once laughed at the idea of me living outside his shadow. Now here I was standing in front of a house that was ours, bought with sweat and sacrifice. On moving day, as I carried boxes up the porch steps, I paused to take it in. The peeling apartment walls were behind us. Ahead was a home filled with possibility. The irony wasn't lost on me. While our lives were climbing steadily upward, my father's empire was beginning to crumble. Rumors reached me through distant relatives. A risky investment had backfired. Lawsuits were piling up. His once glorious company, the pride of our small city, was showing cracks. At first, I brushed it off. My father was a man who had survived downturns before. He had always landed on his feet, but deep down, I wondered if pride would be the one thing he couldn't recover from. Daniel and I didn't celebrate his downfall. That's not who we were. If anything, we focused harder on gratitude, on the fact that despite everything, we were moving forward. But there were nights when I couldn't help but remember his words, "From now on, you are my sworn enemy." What would he think if he saw us now? Not only surviving, but thriving quietly, steadily, without his approval or his wealth. One evening, as Daniel and I sat in our backyard watching fireflies, he turned to me and said, "One day, he'll see. One day, he'll realize you didn't need him, you just needed faith." I squeezed his hand, knowing he was right. That was the beginning of a new phase. The phase where we weren't just clawing our way out of the hole, we were climbing high enough to see the horizon. The seeds we had planted through struggle, through sacrifice, through countless nights of doubt, were finally beginning to bear fruit. And though my father had no idea the tide was turning. By the time Daniel and I had settled into our first real home, the cracks in my father's empire were turning into canyons. At first, it was just whispers, an article in the local business section about one of his development projects, stalling a headline about unpaid contractors, a rumor that his once loyal investors were pulling out. I didn't want to gloat. A part of me still carried the image of my father as the untouchable titan of real estate, the man who could walk into any room and command it. But slowly, his name stopped inspiring awe and started drawing pity. One cousin sent me a text late one night, "Is Uncle okay? Heard the bank might be taking back the office building." I stared at that message for a long time. My father would have considered it betrayal for me even to ask, so I didn't respond. Instead, I set the phone down and sat in silence. I began to hear stories from old acquaintances around town. They said the employees who had once driven luxury cars to work were now worried about paychecks bouncing. My father had always rewarded loyalty with lavish perks, but when the money dried up, so did the admiration. He tried to save face, of course. He still showed up at charity events, though his tuxedos looked a little older, his smile a little tighter. He gave speeches about temporary setbacks and strategic restructuring, but everyone knew the truth: he was losing his grip. Daniel shook his head one evening as he read the paper. Your dad always thought he could outmuscle the market, but sometimes the market humbles even the proudest man. I didn't answer. Deep down, I knew Daniel was right. The hardest blow came when the family estate, the very house where my father had declared me his sworn enemy, was listed for sale. The announcement hit me like a strange mix of nostalgia and justice. That house wasn't just a building. It was the symbol of everything my father valued: status, power, control. It had been the stage for every family Christmas, every Sunday dinner, every lecture about how appearances mattered more than feelings. To imagine it stripped of his name felt surreal. I remember driving past it one evening on my way back from reserve duty. The tall iron gates were still there, but the once manicured lawn had gone a little wild. A for sale sign staked in the yard looked almost absurd, like graffiti on a museum painting. I slowed the car, staring at the house where I had grown up, where my mother's laughter had once filled the halls. And then I thought about my father's words: "From now on, you are my sworn enemy." I whispered to myself, "Looks like the enemy's winning." Meanwhile, Daniel and I were thriving, not rich in the flashy sense, but secure. His renovation business had grown into a legitimate company with employees' contracts and even a fleet of branded trucks. I had earned a promotion in the reserves, gaining respect not just for my work, but for my steady presence. We weren't flashy. We weren't on magazine covers. But we were building something solid, one brick at a time. Still, I couldn't ignore the pull of memory. For all his faults, my father was still my father. And seeing him fall from grace stirred something complicated in me. One afternoon, I spotted him at the grocery store. It had been nearly a decade since we'd spoken. His hair, once jet black and immaculately styled, had thinned to gray. His shoulders slumped. He walked slowly, as if carrying invisible weight. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. This wasn't the booming man who had commanded boardrooms and belittled me with ease. This was someone smaller, older, diminished. He caught sight of me, and for a split second, our eyes met. I expected anger, or maybe contempt. But what I saw instead was a flicker of shame, quick like a shadow across his face. He turned away before I could speak. My heart twisted. I wasn't ready to forgive him, but I wasn't ready to hate him either. Back at home, Daniel found me sitting quietly on the porch, staring into the distance. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked gently. I nodded. "Doesn't feel like victory, does it?" "No," I admitted. "It feels hollow." Daniel sat beside me, his hand resting over mine. Revenge isn't always about watching someone fall. Sometimes it's about proving to yourself that you can rise. His words settled into me like a truth I hadn't wanted to face. As the weeks went by, the news about my father grew more dire. His company filed for bankruptcy. Assets were auctioned off. Lawsuits multiplied. The man who once strode through town like a king now avoided public places. Family members whispered that he had cut himself off, refusing help, refusing to admit defeat. Pride had been his weapon and his shield, and now it was his prison. When I heard that he was selling the estate, I felt a strange stirring of destiny. That house had witnessed the worst moment of my life, the moment he disowned me. And now, fate was handing me the chance to walk back through its doors. Not as the disgraced daughter, not as the poor girl who chose wrong, but as someone who had built her own life, her own strength and her own fortune with the man she loved. The day we signed the papers to purchase it, Daniel slid the contract across the table, his pen steady, his smile calm. There was no gloating in his face, just quiet satisfaction. When the deal was done, I sat in the parking lot with the keys heavy in my palm. My chest ached not with triumph, but with the weight of history. I whispered to myself, it's time. The first time I held the keys to my childhood home, I sat in the driver's seat of our truck and stared at them until the sun dipped behind the hills. They didn't look special, just two brass keys on a ring, but to me, they carried the weight of a lifetime. They were proof that life has a strange way of coming full circle. The estate, the same one where my father had once declared me his sworn enemy, now belonged to Daniel and me. It wasn't just a transaction, it was a turning point. But before we could even move forward with renovations, the realtor called. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," she said carefully, "your father. He's refusing to leave. Legally, the sale is complete, but he hasn't made arrangements to move out." I knew my father's pride too well. To him, leaving that house meant admitting defeat. He would rather cling to the memory of power than face the humiliation of packing boxes. Daniel put down his coffee and said calmly, "Then it's time to go see him." The day we drove up the long driveway, memories flooded me. I remembered running barefoot across that lawn. As a little girl, my mother's voice calling me back for dinner. I remembered Christmas mornings with a tree so tall it brushed the ceiling. I remembered the night my father's voice thundered through those very halls, cutting me off from his world. The house looked tired now. Paint peeled from the shutters. Weeds grew between cracks in the driveway. The grandeur was still there, but it had faded like a suit worn too many times. As we stepped out of the truck, Daniel touched my shoulder. "Are you ready?" I nodded, though my heart was pounding. Inside, the air was heavy. Dust hung in the beams of light streaming through half-closed curtains. The grand chandelier above the foyer was dim, several bulbs burned out. And there, standing in the middle of the room, like a ghost of his former self, was my father. He looked smaller somehow. His once proud posture had slumped. His hair was grayer, his suit wrinkled, but his eyes still carried the spark of defiance. "You?" he said coldly when he saw us. "I should have known." Daniel set the contract on the dining table. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "The sale is done, sir. This house belongs to us now." My father's jaw tightened. "You think you've won. You think this makes you better than me." I stepped forward, my uniform jacket catching the sunlight from the window. "It's not about being better, Dad. It's about moving on. You told me I was your sworn enemy. Well, your enemy grew strong. Not through hatred, but through hard work, through love." His face twisted, but he said nothing. The silence stretched until Daniel broke it with words that fell like stones. "Stay, Dad. This is just our 6th house." The sentence hung in the air, thick with irony. For years, my father had mocked us as poor, worthless beneath him. And now, the truth lay bare, we had built more than he ever imagined. My father's face drained of color. He staggered, catching himself on the edge of the table. His pride cracked in that moment, his arrogance folding under the weight of reality. I should have felt triumphant. I should have savored the moment, but instead I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and release. He slumped into a chair, his voice trembling. "I gave my life to this house, to this empire, and now it's all gone. To you." For the first time, I didn't see the tyrant who had cast me out. I saw a man broken by his own pride, trapped by the very things he valued most. I sat across from him. "You didn't lose to me, Dad. You lost to yourself. Your pride blinded you. You couldn't see that love, loyalty, and sacrifice build stronger foundations than money ever could." His hand shook as he covered his face. I thought I saw the glimmer of tears between his fingers. Daniel, ever steady, placed a hand on my shoulder. "We're not here to humiliate you. We don't want revenge. We want peace." My father looked up slowly, his eyes searching mine. For the first time in years, I saw something human there, not rage, not pride, but regret. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything I said, everything I did, why show me kindness?" "Because you're my father," I said softly, "and because I don't want hate to be the last thing between us." The conversation didn't end with forgiveness. Not yet, but it opened a door. We walked him through the house, talking about what had once been, what could be again. The halls that had once echoed with anger now felt like they could be filled with healing. When we left that evening, he didn't call me his enemy. He didn't call me anything. But he didn't stop me when I kissed his cheek goodbye. That small gesture, after a decade of silence, felt like a crack of light breaking through a long closed window. In the truck on the way home, Daniel squeezed my hand. "That was brave," he said. I stared out at the setting sun. "No," I whispered. "That was necessary." Because revenge, as sweet as it sounds, can never rebuild what hate destroys. And in that moment, I realized my victory wasn't buying the house or proving my father wrong. My victory was refusing to let bitterness define me. The day of the final handover arrived with a weight I could feel in my chest. For weeks, the paperwork had been shuffling between lawyers and agents' signatures, gathering like raindrops before a storm. Now, everything was official. The estate, the crown jewel of my father's pride, was ours. The realtor asked if we wanted to schedule a private walkthrough. Daniel and I exchanged a look. "No," I said. "We'll go when my father is there." This wasn't about furniture or floor plans. It was about something deeper: closure. We parked at the base of the long drive, the same one I had ridden my bike up as a child. The gates creaked open with a tired groan. The house loomed ahead, majestic and weary all at once. I wore my army uniform that day, not to flaunt it, but because it represented everything I had become. Discipline, service, resilience. Daniel held the contract folder under his arm. His expression was steady calm, but I could feel the energy pulsing beneath his composure. As we approached the front door, I felt time fold in on itself. 10 years melted away. I was once again the young woman standing in that foyer, hearing my father's voice thunder. "From now on, you are my sworn enemy." But this time, I wasn't trembling. This time, I wasn't alone. The door opened. My father stood there, shoulders squared, but eyes shadowed. He wasn't dressed in a tailored suit like before. Instead, he wore a simple button-down, the kind that hung loose on his thinner frame. He looked older, much older than the years that had passed. Behind him, the house was almost bare. The grand paintings had been taken down, leaving pale rectangles on the walls. The chandelier hung dull dust, dulling its sparkle. Echoes filled the halls where laughter and arguments once clashed like thunder. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Daniel stepped forward and placed the folder gently on the dining table, the sound sharp in the empty space. "The sale is done," Daniel said quietly. "This house is no longer yours to carry alone." My father's lips tightened. His gaze darted to me. "You came here to gloat." I shook my head. "No, I came here to close a chapter." He laughed bitterly, a sound more like a cough. "Close a chapter. You've taken everything. My company, my house, my legacy." Daniel's voice stayed calm, but there was steel in it. "We didn't take anything. You lost it by clinging to pride. We simply built what you thought was impossible." The words hit harder than if he'd shouted. I stepped closer, my boots clicking against the hardwood. My uniform caught the fading light from the window. "Dad, look at me. You called me your sworn enemy. But here I stand. Not your enemy, not your victim. I am your daughter. And I am stronger than the woman you cast out." His face went pale. His hand gripped the back of a chair for balance. In that moment, I saw the walls around him crack, the arrogance, the bravado, all crumbling under the truth standing before him. Daniel's voice cut the silence like a blade. "Stay, Dad. It's just our 6th house." The sentence echoed through the empty halls. It was not a boast, but a quiet fact. A truth that stripped the last armor from my father's pride. He stumbled back, his face white, his breath ragged. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes, not of me, but of the mirror we held up to him. The silence stretched heavy as stone. Then slowly my father lowered himself into the chair at the head of the table, the same chair where he had once ruled family dinners with iron authority. His voice trembled. "I built this house with my hands, my sweat. I built an empire so my family would never know struggle. And now, it's gone. To you." I sat across from him, steady, calm. Yes, it's gone, but not because of me, because you chose pride over love. You cast me out thinking wealth mattered more than family. And now, here we are. His eyes glistened, and for a moment I thought he might break down. Instead, he whispered, "What do you want from me?" I leaned forward, my voice soft but firm. "I don't want anything. I came to tell you that you were wrong, that love, sacrifice, and hard work built something stronger than money ever could. We didn't rise out of hate. We rose because we believed in each other." Daniel's hand rested lightly on my shoulder. His presence reminded me of every mile we had traveled together, every late night of exhaustion and hope. "We don't need revenge," he added gently. "We don't need your empire. We just need peace." My father's shoulders sagged. For a long time, he stared at the empty table, the silence of the house pressing down. I thought about my mother, how she had loved this place, how she had always tried to soften the sharp edges between us. I wondered what she would say if she could see us now. Finally, my father spoke, his voice rough. "I don't know if I can give you peace. Not after everything." "You don't have to," I replied. "Just stop calling me your enemy. That's enough." He didn't answer. But when I stood to leave, he didn't stop me. He didn't roar, didn't threaten. He simply sat there, silent, humbled, broken. As Daniel and I walked back toward the door, I felt the weight of years lifting from my chest. The house no longer belonged to him. The curse of his words no longer bound me. The door closed behind us with a heavy click, not of exile, but of conclusion. In the truck, Daniel exhaled slowly. That was it. The moment. I nodded, my eyes still fixed on the house in the rearview mirror. "Yes," I said quietly. That was the moment we turned the page. In the weeks after that confrontation, I carried a storm of emotions. Relief, sorrow, and an ache I couldn't quite name. For years, I had imagined that if I ever stood victorious before my father, I would feel triumphant. But the truth was quieter, heavier. Victory without peace tastes hollow. Daniel and I moved forward with our plans for the estate. Renovations began, fresh paint, new windows, repairs to the roof that had been neglected for too long. The workers bustled in and out, filling the halls with the noise of drills and hammers, chasing away the silence that had haunted the place. But even as the house transformed, I felt an emptiness in its walls. My father had poured his life into this place, and now he lingered at its edges like a man without an anchor. He hadn't left town. In fact, I learned from a neighbor that he had rented a small apartment nearby. Alone. I thought of him often. How he had looked when Daniel told him, "Stay, Dad. It's just our 6th house." His face pale, his pride crumbling. And I wondered if that was really the ending I wanted. One chilly autumn afternoon, I found myself walking past the diner near Main Street, the one my father used to frequent for coffee and pie. And there he was, sitting at the counter, hunched over a cup like it was the last bit of warmth he could hold on to. For a long moment, I stood in the doorway, debating whether to step inside. The last time I had been in a diner with him, he had lectured me about responsibility, about marrying someone worthy. Now, all I saw was an aging man staring into his reflection in black coffee. I took a breath and walked in. His eyes flicked up, and for a moment confusion clouded them. Then recognition. Then shame. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. I sat down beside him. Maybe, but I am. We sat in silence, the clink of plates and the hiss of the coffee machine filling the space between us. Finally, he spoke. I was wrong. The words were ragged, pulled from somewhere deep. I thought money would protect us. I thought control would keep the family strong, but it only drove you away. I swallowed hard tears, burning at the corners of my eyes. "You hurt me, Dad, more than I can explain. But I don't want the rest of our lives to be defined by that night." He turned to me then, and I saw not the giant who had cast me out, but a man, humbled, weathered, stripped of armor. Do you think there's still time to fix it?" I reached for his hand. His skin was thin, the veins pronounced. "There's always time," I said softly. The weeks that followed were not easy. Forgiveness is never a single moment. It's a journey. My father began visiting the estate not as its master, but as a guest. At first, he walked through the rooms quietly, his eyes distant. But slowly, he began to speak. Stories of my mother, of the early years, when money was tight, but laughter was plenty. Memories I had never heard before spilled out, softening the sharp edges of the past. Daniel welcomed him with quiet grace. There was no smugness in him, no rubbing salt into old wounds. Instead, he offered my father coffee, showed him the garden we had planted, even asked his advice on a renovation detail. To my surprise, my father gave it earnestly without pretense. Something fragile began to grow between us. Not a full return to the way things had been that was impossible, but something new, something honest. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, my father cleared his throat. "I called you my enemy," he said. His voice cracked. "But you were never my enemy. You were my mirror. You showed me everything I was afraid to see." Tears slipped down my cheeks. "Then let's put that word to rest," I whispered. He nodded, his eyes glistening. "No more enemies, just family." That night, I lay awake beside Daniel, listening to the crickets outside. My heart felt lighter than it had in years. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer defined me. They no longer defined us. I thought back to that night a decade earlier, when my father's roar had cut me out of his life. "From now on, you are my sworn enemy." And I thought of tonight, when he had finally quietly taken those words back. Life had come full circle, not with vengeance, but with healing. To those listening to my story, I want you to hear this: pride can destroy. Wealth can crumble. But love, the stubborn, steady kind of love, can outlast it all. If you've been cast out, if you've been told you're not enough, hold on. Build your life with courage. Prove them wrong, not with bitterness, but with the quiet power of perseverance. And if you're holding on to anger, let this be a reminder: reconciliation is possible. The door to forgiveness may feel heavy, but sometimes all it takes is the courage to push it open. So tonight, as I sit in this old house, now filled with laughter and not just echoes, I am grateful. Grateful for Daniel. Grateful for the struggles that forged us. And even grateful for the chance to look my father in the eye and find something human again. No more enemies, just lessons, just family. And to you, thank you for listening. If this story touched you, I invite you to reflect, to share it with someone who might need to hear it, and to join me for more journeys of resilience, redemption, and hope. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not in crushing your enemy, but in choosing to heal.